Love is leading me on. Amen? So I was on a walk this week at one of our area parks and just taking my walk around the loop. There's kids' play equipment in the middle, and I was on the path, and there was a mother strolling her little girl, an African-American mother, African-American little girl, about under 2 years old, between 1 and 2. And as I was walking by, and I was looking at their beauty as they were coming toward me, and as I was walking by, I noticed the little girl was looking up at me, and I was looking down at her. And she just looked at me as the stroller was going, didn't even stop, but as the stroller was going, she looked at me and she goes, "Can I have a hug?" And of course, I just stopped in my tracks and said, "Of course, I would love a hug. Thank you." And then she said, "I love you." And I said, "I love you too." Is love always leading us on? Can we recognize the sacred and the miracle every day? And can we, in fact, become like the little children? Can we truly practice that? To become like a child that can walk by someone in the park and see that right in front of me, there is someone here to hug me. At any moment, it is relevant for me to ask you for a hug. In any moment, it is relevant for me to say, "I love you." In any moment, it is relevant for me to act like you are mine and I am yours. Gifts from a little bodhisattva this week. A little Buddha in the park. In Matthew 18:3, it says, "And he said, 'Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.'" Unless you see life with a beginner's mind and you step apart from all of the illusions that divide us, that separate, that judge, that bring us into ego, that bring us all in through the delusions of the human condition, unless we step aside and truly arrive in each moment with a beginner's mind, we will not experience the kingdom of heaven, which is the aspect of consciousness. It is the field of consciousness where love resides, where love demonstrates, and where our birthright is naturally felt and expressed. But until we see that way, until we see through those eyes, and it is not the most natural part of our human condition to do that, because we do become accustomed to the teachings of our society, of our community, or our upbringing. And that is like putting lenses over our true spiritual vision. Are we willing to take those lenses off? Are we willing to fully step aside and let the human condition rest while we presence the spiritual practice in each moment? There are a lot of things going on today, aren't there? There are a lot of things going on within us, and there are a lot of things going on in our world. We are showing the film this afternoon. It's called White Like Me. And it's on all the parts that we may not be present to, we may not see as individuals, as a community. It's about stepping into each other's experiences and waking up and checking in to see, are we awake? How awake are we? There's other things going on in our world where some folks are shouting out now, "Listen to my experience," no? Where our youth are standing in their strength and standing in their courage, and they're saying, "I've had an experience, listen to me." Are we willing to step out of our own imaginings, our own ideas of what we think someone else's experience, in whether it's white privilege and racism, whether it's some other cultural experience that separates us, whether it's mass shootings, whatever it is, if we're not the one that directly experienced it, if I'm not the one who directly experienced it, am I willing to step back and listen to the experts? Am I willing to listen to those who have walked in the shoes? Am I willing to set aside my own ideas and say, I'm going to move beyond sympathy and I'm going to move into empathy so I can be with you. In the Jewish tradition, when someone passes you, there's a tradition of sitting Shiva. And when you do that, it's you have days of just being in the presence, being with the death, being with someone who passes. And the family sits and people come to visit and you spend time, you really be with it. A lot of times when we look at our own personal development work, we talk about empathy and sympathy, and we talk about how empathizing too much can sometimes be very difficult. Sometimes we can become codependent when we take on other people's experiences, and we can shut ourselves down, and it can be very difficult. We can start feeling everything, and through feeling everything, we become raw. And we actually begin to disconnect in different ways. But when we haven't walked in someone's shoes, that is the perfect time for empathy, and I think there is no amount of empathy that would be unjustified. So if I haven't experienced what it's like to be a black man that's pulled over in today's society, it's not mine to be the expert at it. It's not mine to cast my judgments. It's not mine to make my assessments. If I haven't been in a mass shooting, it's not mine to judge someone else's experience. And in fact, when are we going to wake up as a society and recognize all we would need to do is get the people that have been directly affected? And of course, we're all affected by everything, no? There's no possibility that something can happen to one child of God that doesn't ricochet out through the whole. It's an illusion to think, even if we can stand in the illusion and think somehow there can be poverty somewhere, or racism somewhere, or injustice somewhere, or injury somewhere, that I will not feel it and be affected by it in my life. That's an illusion. But until we're willing to bring all of the experts, all of those who have experienced it, all of those, as the Daily Word said, who have a story and are ready to share the story, until we're ready to step into that circle with them in full empathy and experience that, not just sympathize, but experience it with them to the degree that we possibly can, we won't be awake. And if we really want true solutions can come from the people that are affected by it. Those are the people to ask. The people that are affected by it firsthand, that see it eye to eye, that see it face to face, that feel it heart to heart. Those are the people to say, how can we show up differently? What should we do? What are some solutions? And it's all of ours to listen when that happens, right? When we shut down stories, when we shut down experience, we limit our wisdom. The master teacher walked in a way that he fully presenced and went into people's stories. So rather than the leadership of the time that was casting stones and making judgments from afar, from outside of the circle, he didn't stand on the edge casting the stones. He walked into the center, looked eye to eye, and met people where they were. He walked up right to the people who were ill, who were sick. He didn't stand at the door and say, I bless you and I pray for you from afar. He walked to the leper. He walked to the person who was injured, to the person who was disconnected. And he stood from within that experience. From within that experience. And through merging, through coming together, healing happened, awakening happened. But it wasn't from stepping aside and not hearing and feeling the story, not merging and joining. When we have firsthand experience, or the closest we can get to it, we begin to awaken our consciousness and our compassion. To try to understand a grieving mother from afar, of going, well, I imagine, if that happened to me, I would this and I would that, is completely futile. Because until you sit with a mother who is wailing and you hold her or you hear her, all of the words that you could try to come up with, right, would be a miss. Just a waste of sound. Until you truly show up for someone's heart, there can't be healing. There is a story that I ran across about a mother who adopted. She had, I think, 3 or 4 biological children of her own. And then she adopted 3 more children who were African American. She had a white family. And in her experience of adopting, Jen Hatmaker in Texas had a great awakening. She said that she thought she was aware of a lot of things, but she wasn't. And when she adopted these beautiful children, she had so much learning to do. And she said it wasn't until she took on some Black mentors to support her coming out of her naivety into the light, into understanding, was she able to really show up for her children, that it was a wake-up call around what she really thought was going on versus experiencing it. And she said it was a shift for her other children as well, to really experience firsthand, not from stories, not from the news, not from books and not from ideas, but firsthand what it's like to have a multiracial family. And she said this, she said, if I am unwilling to be an advocate not just for my son and daughter, but for all Black sons and daughters, what am I doing here? I have no right to be their mother. That was her awakening after realizing her own experience. So she first worked with her own family and her own community. But after becoming more masterful at that experience, she said, I can't stop here. If I were to stop here, I have no right to be their mother, because I need to be part of transforming the world. I need to bring my transformation story to others so that when they were innocently, just like I was, innocently having ideas about how things were, I can support their awakening. That's what the master teacher did walking on this planet, and that's what each of us has before us in different ways. Empathy is the ability to experience the feelings of another person. It goes beyond sympathy, which is caring and understanding for the suffering of others. That's good. But for this deep transformation, for this deep healing, it takes empathy. It's not just about acknowledging. It's about doing our best to put ourselves in others' shoes, not trying to analyze something, but allowing ourselves the vulnerability of feeling something. And if we have the gift of it for a moment, experiencing it. In 1 Corinthians 13:12, it says, for now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Are we willing to step from sympathy to empathy, to a deeper understanding of that which is sacred, so that rather than using our own imaginations or our own fears or our own analysis or our own predictions, we can allow ourselves to be guided by the still small voice, by the silence in a moment, by the growing compassion that can only be awakened by becoming still. It can't come through the mind. It can only come through the heart. And only when we use the wisdom of the heart will we ideate divine solutions. The heart is spoken about in Scripture as being a real feminine aspect of God. It's known as being Lady Wisdom. And when we become present to Lady Wisdom, we have solutions, we have answers that are not temporal, that not only work just for some people, but that cultivate the sacred in everyday life. There's an Asian town where in the middle of the town, where there's monuments and statues and restaurants and people walking, there are deer all over. And the people just interact with the deer. And it's known that the deer are completely safe there and completely welcome there because they are sacred animals. Because the deer are known to be sacred in that area. Sacred. So there's not a this should be or that should be, you should be here or you shouldn't be here. But there's an acknowledgement, a communing, a difference. Whereas in other places, they're not treated as sacred or cared for. There are places they shouldn't be and places they should be. Can we wake up to true compassion? Can we wake up and see differently? A lot of times looking out at our world today, it can be hard to have hope, no? It can be hard to think that we can wake up from some of the systems that seem to be stuck, from some of the mindsets that seem to be limited, from some of the ideas that are missing the mark severely. But when we see eye to eye and heart to heart, there is hope. Because the power in the heart to heal goes beyond anything we could imagine. It can heal any injury. It can rectify any situation. But it just takes showing up heart to heart and eye to eye. There is a man named Christian Picciolini, and if you have listened to NPR lately, you might have heard his story. But he has a book out called White American Youth, and the subtitle is My Descent into America's Most Violent Hate Movement, and How I Got Out. And How I Got Out, the key piece. And he talked on NPR about his experience and how he got into the movement. And he talked about how he was vulnerable to the degree that he didn't have really a depth of self-worth. And through this experience with others, they began talking to him in a way that he began feeling some pride in himself. He began to see some of the things that were unique or special about himself. And people talked to him about his Italian background and how that was something to be honored, and different parts of his history and his growing up and how that was special. And he started to feel a pride. And once they got him to the place where he was feeling that pride, where he was feeling part of something greater, where he was feeling his self-worth, they began to give him stories about people who were threatening that. About people who, if left to their own accord, will take that away. He began to get stories and conspiracy theories about specific groups that were, as he said, bent on taking that pride and privilege away from him. He said it was fear rhetoric. And he acknowledged that the way he was recruited, the way they got to his mind, and the way he then got to the minds of other young people was in that same way. They were recruited, he said, through their vulnerabilities, not through ideology. It was through their vulnerabilities, not through ideology. So he was introduced to this hate movement, this neo-Nazi movement that he became a part of. He was, and he goes through these stories. He was vicious. He would attack people. It was horrific. But he said they didn't first get him through the ideology. They didn't just get him selling him on the idea that people of other races and nationalities were awful and deserved to be abused and minimalized, bullied and mistreated, attacked, diminished, dead. That's not how they got in. They got in because he was lacking a sense of self-worth. They got in because he was vulnerable within his own being, because he didn't have that sense of being loved and knowing himself and honoring himself. In fact, that sense of knowing he was born blessed, and he was worthy. And there was nothing he could do, nothing anyone could say that could take away that worthiness. And in fact, that worthiness could never be threatened, that one's worthiness could never diminish another. Thank goodness for the teachings of unity that bring people up in this knowing that the truth of their being is not vulnerable to anything from the outside. He went on to talk about his healing, which I was most interested in. Like, how did you come out of this? Because he was in it for about 8 years. He was a neo-Nazi. And I thought to myself, as I was hearing this story, the courage of this man to share this story and to help other people, because who would want to share that story, right? I mean, if that used to be you, would you want anyone to know? Anyone? He talks about his healing, and he says he had opened a record store, and he got into hate music. It sounds like he was kind of a master at it, a leader at it. And he opened a record store in Chicago. And he said the community, even though it's Chicago, everybody knew what I was doing. Everybody knew how hateful I was and how violent I was. But these customers came in despite that. He says, and over time, I started to have meaningful interactions with them for the first time in my life. In fact, I had never in my life engaged in a meaningful dialogue with the people that I thought I hated, and it was these folks who showed me empathy when I least deserved it. It was these folks who showed me empathy when I least deserved it. And he said, and they were the ones that I least deserved it from. The ones who were showing it were the ones I least deserved it from. He said, I started to recognize that I had more in common with them than the people I had surrounded myself with for 8 years. That these people I thought I had hated took it upon themselves to see something inside of me that I didn't even see myself. And it was because of that connection that I was able to humanize them. And that destroyed the demonization and the prejudice that was happening inside of me. Music brought me in, but in many ways, it also brought me out. He went on to share another key piece of his awakening story and his transformation, his amazing grace. He said that there was a specific incident in which he was beating a young black man. And this was something common that he did. It might to us go, oh, but this was daily. This was his life. He said in a moment, when he was over him beating him, the man was on the ground. He said his eyes locked with his victim, and he felt a surprising empathy. He met him eye to eye, all of a sudden in the midst of it, not with all the beatings that came before, but in this moment, he met him and they locked eyes. Eye to eye, he saw him. And he went on to share about his experience. It's like he had a moment of being in a portal where it was like, that's my brother, that's my sister, that's my mother, my father, my uncle, that's everyone I know. And he got it. He woke up. Not because he was distant, but because he was given the gift of entering into the circle and becoming one with someone else's experience in a moment, of recognizing it from a different angle, from a different space, from getting out of his own prejudice, his own mind, and just being with an experience of eye to eye, heart to heart. That was a turning point. That was the last moment that he did that. He withdrew from the movement, and after that, he co-founded a nonprofit called Life After Hate and dedicated himself to bringing people out of the neo-Nazi movement. to bringing people out of the ideas of white supremacy and into the ideas of love, and that we're born blessed and that we're here to be brothers and sisters. And he began to use his story to heal. A story that many people may have wanted to hide and act like they never experienced it. But he didn't hide it, he shared it. And he allowed it to heal him. There's another story of a matador. His name is Torero Alvaro Munera, and he had a great career as a matador. But there was one moment while he was mid-fight. He was in mid-fight, and he realized that he kept having to prompt the beast or the bull to fight. That the fight on the other side stopped, and he kept having to prompt him to fight. Now he had done this time and time again, right? This was his job. This was his livelihood. This is what he was good at. But in a moment, even when it was grievously wounded by picadors, this bull did not attack him. And there's an incredible image. We'll post it on Facebook later today. But there's this incredible image of mid-fight. And Torero says this: "Suddenly, I looked at the bull. He had this innocence that all animals have in their eyes. And he looked at me with this pleading. It was like a cry for justice deep down inside me. I describe it as being like a prayer. Because if one confesses, it is hoped that one is forgiven. I felt like the worst on earth. In that moment, his fighting ended. In that moment, he was awake. In that moment, he became an avid opponent of bullfights. It stopped in that moment because he met the animal heart to heart, eye to eye. When we do that, friends, it is a prayer. It is a prayer that has life. It is a prayer that opens doors. And until we're willing to do that with each other, with the community around us, with anyone who has a story and is sharing their story in dedication to awakening, when we can recognize the courage of sharing a story, and rather than making it something outside of ourselves and thinking about it intellectually, if we can open our hearts and step into that story, we step into a moment of prayer and a moment of communion. And that creates a moment of healing. I want to close with the words from Matt Licata, a spiritual teacher on non-duality. He says, "Some will tell you that fear is the opposite of love. And in this teaching, the war begins. But love has no opposite. It is whole and without division. Love is the field in which all forms come and go, including the temporary, wave-like appearance of fear. It is the vast, tender space in which all thoughts, feelings, and sensations arise, play for a short while, and then dissolve. Just like passing clouds could never taint the purity of the sky, the temporary dance of fear could never stain the majesty of what you are. This is the truth of all being. This is the truth of you, me, everyone on this planet, all life. This is our spiritual practice. This is our birthright and our conscious destiny. Namaste."